Hi, everyone. I'm Thane Rosenbaum. I'm the creative director of the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society at Touro University, and welcome to the FOLCS Conversation Series. Tonight, our special guest, the wondrous and always charming Dahlia Lithwick. You know her from Slate, where she is a senior writer and a national legal affairs correspondent, first among equals in the trade. She's also a contributor to MSNBC. You see her all the time. She's also a FOLCS fan favorite. She's been on this program probably 5 or 6 times. We've had her since the very, very beginning. I think, we had there was like little Dahlia Lithwick before she was really, really famous. I don't want to say we discovered her, but I think we discovered her because she was with us, and she's been also a terrific friend. Oh, I should also remind everyone or tell Dahlia that the last event we did for Law of the Land over the summer, we literally got 2 people right in and said, "Where's Dahlia?" They expected you for that. So we'll see you next year. She's been a really terrific friend to me for many years. And, I was thinking about this, Dahlia, even before we knew each other. And this is a very good anecdote about the times in which we live. Polarizing, divisive, people can't seem to agree on anything. Everybody moralizing to each other. If you don't agree with everything I say in the standard time I say it, then you're out, you're history to me, you're dead to me. There was a time that wasn't true. And you know what I was thinking of, Dahlia? You reviewed one of my books for the New York Times, The Myth of Moral Justice. And while there were lovely pull quotes here and there, it was a mixed review. And I can tell you, Dahlia, I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I remember how excited I was by it, and I love that you wrote it. And it never occurred to me that there, you throw ideas out into the world, and people respond to those ideas. That's what happens. Frankly, that's what FOLCS is about. It's about ideas. We're nonpartisan. We're non-ideological. We're not hysterical. We go where the ideas go. And I was thinking about that a moment ago, when I thought, you know what, that's how I know you, from a review in the New York Times. Dahlia, welcome back to FOLCS.
Thank you for having me. And thank you to FOLCS. And really thanks. There's actually few people I wanted more to be in conversation with on this book, in no small part, because I feel like I often hear you in my head and all the things we've talked about over the years. So it means a ton to come kind of home, one of the first places I ever spoke, and to be with you. So thank you.
Dahlia, you just made our highlight reel. That was awesome.
Okay.
I'm walking away from that. This is a mic
We're
drop
done.
for me.
Yeah, we're out.
That was about as good as it'll ever get from me. So thank you. This is the new book, Lady Justice, Women, the Law, and the Battle to Save America. Here it is, everybody. Let me tell you right now, for the first 2 weeks of its publication, it was on the New York Times bestseller list. Let me tell you some news. It's sold out already in its 3rd week. So we have a link for you in our chat box. Please go buy your book on Amazon because they're literally, I'm sorry, I'm not a cliche guy, but this book is truly flying off the presses. I had never really heard anything like that. 2 printing so quickly, and now all of a sudden they're racing to get a 3rd one done. And I'll tell you why. It is, Dahlia, I must tell you, I'm a big fan, as you know, compulsively readable and very personally revealing in a way. I don't know if many people would describe it as it's also a memoir. It's written in a novelistic style, which I thought to myself, Dahlia, in our family, I'm the novelist. But actually, this book is written in a very novelistic way. It chronicles the story of the crusading women lawyers who responded to the age of Donald Trump. And by that, I mean the Muslim travel ban, neo-Nazis marching in Charlottesville, abortion restrictions, voter suppression. And it deals with people, women, both activists and lawyers, who many readers will not know. That's what's so remarkable. They are truly unsung heroes, and you've made them all come alive. You've animated them, and it's a remarkable achievement, Dahlia, really. And to prove how compulsively readable it is, I want to read a few of some of my favorite excerpts. All right, let's see if I can find. Yeah, let's see, is this one? All right, here's one. This is about the Nazis marching in Charlottesville. You said, the lingering question of how to deal with bigots who feed off the outrage they engender seems like the defining question of our lifetime. Wow. Here's something about the First Amendment. It's about marching and protests. You say, it's easy to forget that marching itself is protected First Amendment activity. It is democracy hitting asphalt. Wow, love that. Let's see, what else do I got? Oh, I love this. You're talking about the neo-Nazis and you say, it's the story of white nationalism as largely a sad product of too many years spent living as an adult in your parents' basement. All right, here's another zinger. You say, I used to joke for years that when I wrote articles about the composition of the federal courts, only my dad read them. But that's not quite right. I don't think even he read them. And then you say, you come back, you said, when Dr. Ford testified in the confirmation hearing of Brett Kavanaugh, it changed everything. And meaning that then everybody was interested in the composition of the courts. And I think, let me just read this slide. This is sort of near the end of the book, and it very much defines what the book is about, and then we'll wind you up. Throughout the Trump years, women who were asking themselves, what can I do, learned that whether we notice it or not, the law organizes every part of our lives. Lashing ourselves to legal ideas, movements, and causes gave us power. It organized us, it focused us, it connected us to first principles and lofty ideals. And every step of the way, the wins felt tangible and material and enduring. Wow, that is a restaurant quality sentence, my friend. Really
I could
awesome.
just listen to you read pull quotes all day. We could
No, those were good pull quotes. There might have been a few more in there. So Dahlia, it is really a book about unsung heroes. It's really a book about lawyers and activists, lawyers who in some ways are not just who become activists. It's a lot about, it's not just about fighting in court, it's about grassroots organizing. So talk a little about that, because obviously you were observing something during the 4 years. Yes, you're paid to do so as a journalist, but you were seeing something. You were making direct connections that frankly I missed, and I'll get to some of them. So start us up.
I mean, I would say that the arc of this book is very much the arc of what I learned, covering not just the 4 years of the Trump administration, but I would say, you know, beyond and into the moment we're in now, which is, I think, a moment in which, you know, democracy and rule of law are still in peril. And I think that the arc of the book very much follows, in some sense, the arc of what I learned in that time. So it's not an accident in some sense that the book starts with Sally Yates, you know, who is white, who is a third-generation attorney, you know, somebody who was the acting attorney general at the Justice Department, who said no, she wouldn't enforce the travel ban. And it makes sense in some worldview that you start with the kind of classic Frank Capra, you know, hero who stands up and says lots of ennobling things about the rule of law. And that is important, and I don't in any way mean to minimize it, but the book lands, perhaps paradoxically, on another Georgian lawyer, Stacey Abrams, who is Black, who at the time was not famous, who was very much not the product of, you know, third, fourth generation attorneys who had to really claw her way into the legal profession. And it ends with, you know, the organizing that she's doing in huge groups of women, chiefly Black and brown women on the ground, not just prevailing in lawsuits, not just kind of making Frank Capra speeches about the nobility of the law or the institution of the Justice Department, but the need for democracy reform itself. And I guess maybe what I want to say is that the arc of the book, both in going from a white woman to a Black woman, from one person who's a lone hero to armies of unsung heroes, many of whose names we'll never know, going from, you know, the highest echelons of the Justice Department and institutions to grassroots organizing on the ground, all of those arcs were really quite purposive in my learning about how you beat back forces of, fascism or totalitarianism or authoritarianism or attacks on the rule of law.
I have a great anecdote I'm going to bring up later about that very idea that you're going to love, and it's a FOLCS event as well. Before I go, I forgot to tell everyone, if you have questions for Dahlia, please leave them in the Q&A box. If you want to purchase Lady Justice, go to the chat box. For those of you watching us live on YouTube, welcome. We love having you. Thanks for joining our channel, and also come to folks.org and sign up so you'll know what our next events are. I love the line that comes up a few times in the book. Do something, show up. It cuts to the point that you just said before, right? You would think in reading this book, oh shit, Lithwick wants me to go to law school. That's the only way I can participate in representative democracy and save our democracy is if I go to law school and take a public interest job. And in fact, as you just said, the book really says, do something and show up, and it doesn't require a law degree, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think law is a team sport. And I think we have made a category error time and time and time again in thinking that Bob Mueller was going to save us, in thinking that Merrick Garland was going to save us, in thinking that, Adam Schiff is going to save us. And I keep thinking, the emoticon that everyone used throughout Mueller, throughout the 2 impeachment trials, was that popping popcorn. I'm just going to sit back here, I'm going to pop some popcorn and watch. And that's antithetical to how both democracy and the rule of law work. There's no one hero who fixes it for the rest of us. And I think that one of the things that I really wanted to tilt at was this notion that I think, and I reference in the introduction, Rebecca Solnit has a great essay called When the Hero is the Problem.
Yeah.
But I think that there is an almost uniquely American tendency to fall into this thinking that, yes, the law is going to save us, but it's going to be enforced by some extrinsic actor, in a white hat.
John Wayne.
And I have the mug. And what I wanted to sort of really probe is, I don't think that's a useful story for democracy itself. In fact, I think it's quite disempowering. But more fundamentally, I actually don't think it's how women have ever done law.
Right.
I think that women have been doing law in groups, frequently without law degrees, because for an awfully long time they couldn't get them. And that was the counter narrative that I wanted to tell, because I think it's a much more inspiring and powerful story.
When the book, you actually use the phrase, the great man theory, right? You could also say the great woman theory. And in some ways, the book is sort of a contradiction or an attack against that thinking, to say, no, this book, the irony, as you were just talking a moment ago, I thought probably the founding fathers would agree with too. They might not have agreed that women would be at the forefront, but none of them, with the exception of Adams, they weren't lawyers. The First Amendment to them meant active participation in the public square in representative participatory democracy. It wasn't go file a lawsuit. They didn't think that way.
Think of de Tocqueville. The thing that he fell in love with was exactly what you're describing. That's not a legal proposition.
Yeah. No, good point. Tell me about the book. Clearly, it doesn't say it explicitly, but it does suggest, and I think it's important to say it up front, women simply bring special skills to the dance. They just do. They make it better. They do. They make it better, and they bring special skills that, especially when it comes to organizing, that might actually, and that's what I think the book leads to, this direction, that you probably would have a harder time locating 6 or 7 men and tell this kind of story. This kind of story was told by women about women, and something that women bring to this discussion: a patience, a resilience, I suspect a capacity to accept rejection and move on the next day. I'm talking as a man, so maybe I should not talk. Tell me.
I think that's right. And I want to be clear, and it's clear in the book, that I'm not super comfortable with this kind of essentializing, right? I mean, I really, I covered for 22 years, I've covered the Supreme Court. It's very clear even in the first years, that O'Connor and Ginsburg were very different characters.
Yeah.
And that you kind of compare them at your peril. But I also really came down in the place that you are at. And there are a few reasons why. And one of them is, I do think that there is a real benefit to being an outsider in the legal system, and to operating in a system that both sees you as a player, but never quite a player. I think it gives you a split scene, kind of split screen appreciation for alternate realities and alternate narratives. And I think that's really important. I mean, I think, to me, sort of, if you think about the law as a process of analogy, a process of, drawing connection between precedent and the next set of facts, I think to have a capacious imagination is very, very helpful. And then I think there's another thing, and I do just make the claim overtly in the end of the book, and I say that I think women do have a special relationship with the law. And I think it's this. I think that for most of history, the law was used against women.
Right.
It was weaponized to take away bodily autonomy, property rights, equality rights, the right to vote. And to be given that means that you had to fight for it. And I think maybe this is a version of your, you learn to take your lumps. I think that one of the things I felt happening in the Trump years, and in the book, I sort of cite to the lock her up chants about Hillary Clinton, is that women were starting to realize that the same instrumentalities that made them free and equal and gave them dignity and gave them the vote and gave them the right to have a credit card, all of those things could be on a dime used against them to make them unsafe. And whether it's, the threats to women, whether it's Dobbs and threats to reproductive freedom, whether it's, women who are locked up all around the country now because of, claims about endangering their pregnancies. So I want to say that I think somewhere in our muscle memory, and I actually think this is true for people of color who also had to really fight their way into constitutional and statutory equality, and for LGBTQ Americans, I think that consciousness that the law is both a machine that makes you free and equal and a machine that could take it all away makes you very, very vulnerable and also very powerful. And I think that's at the heart of the claim that I'm trying to make.
As you're talking, I was reminding, I wrote about Justice Sotomayor when she was first nominated. And you wrote about this too, I'm sure, and about maybe this very point, which was that when President Obama introduced her to the nation, he said, and I remember this because I wrote about this thing, he said, she has a compelling life story. And if you remember, conservatives were critical. They said, what does that mean? Her life story is supposed to be meaningless. We're supposed to be here objectively determining who's the best person for the job as a Supreme Court justice, which deals with their legal acumen. It doesn't have anything to do with their compelling life circumstances. And what I wrote about was saying there's something really warped in that we would want people that only went to prep school and then Yale Law School, and then that's what we want, and clerked on this, and clerked for Supreme Court justices, and worked on the DC circuit, that's the only court requirement we have, instead of a Puerto Rican woman who grew up in a housing project in the Bronx. Yeah, that's exactly what you want. And in that article, I talked about, remember, Virginia versus Black, which was the very first time that Justice Thomas sort of stepped into the shoes of a Black man openly, explicitly, by saying, my granddaddy used to tell me about the Klan. And everyone was shocked when he told everyone that story. I actually think it was one of the great moments in Supreme Court history when everyone was shocked. And I have a thought that it altered the opinion, because everyone looked at him and said, wow, if Clarence is going to talk about his experience with his living in the South, maybe this is something, true threats or something we should take seriously. So I think it is something that we're missing, and that women naturally bring that to the discussion in every way.
I mean, there's every single justice who ever sat with Thurgood Marshall would tell some iteration of the story you just told, including, by the way, Justice Scalia, including, by the way, wow. Justice Kennedy and O'Connor would say you would go into conference with Thurgood Marshall And he would, and he famously would have these stories about, trying to litigate a case in the Jim Crow South, and they wouldn't let him enter the courthouse, or he had to escape out a side door because people were, he feared for his life. Every one of them said, I didn't know what I didn't know until he told me.
Yeah. Wow.
And that, I think, is just, I mean, the paradox is that both Justice Alito and Justice Thomas were celebrated for their life stories that they brought to the court. So there's this funny thing that happens when, it's Sotomayor or Ketanji Brown Jackson, and people say, oh, this is an affirmative action pick. This is someone who's being chosen, based on their race or their color. But of course, that was exactly the story they told about Justice Scalia. They explicitly wanted an Italian American. And, we've seen this certainly with the Jewish seat at the court too, that they're, it's funny that it's seen as enriching in some instances and as disqualifying in others. But I agree with you. I think that there's real utility in having a justice at the conference table who's able to say, let me tell you about a thing that you don't know, and having the other justices listen.
When we had Mario Cuomo years ago at FOLCS, I asked him, he was apparently, we learned, if he was actually Bill Clinton's first pick. He wanted to pick Mario Cuomo, and that would have been Ruth Bader Ginsburg's seat, right? So it's possible that we would have never had Justice Breyer. Imagine that, right? Or we wouldn't have necessarily had Justice Breyer. And I raised this question with Cuomo, and he talked about why he declined the seat. But one of the things he said was, everyone was rooting for me because they thought they needed a progressive Italian to challenge Scalia. And I thought, well, that actually would have been interesting, right? I mean, for the reasons you said, compelling life, we have an Italian Catholic, and we have another Italian Catholic who is pro-abortion. Pauline Murray. Can we briefly talk a little about her? I'm embarrassed to say I have no idea who she was. And yet this is a woman, it seems to me, that had something to do with Brown versus Board of Education, has something to do with the Civil Rights Act, and was so far in the background that I didn't even know anything about her.
I mean, Thane, I didn't know much about Pauline Murray. And maybe I would start by saying, Pauline Murray came up in a time where multiple doors were closed because Pauline Murray was Black, and multiple other doors were closed because Pauline Murray was a woman. Pauline Murray also was very, very much gender nonconforming. Probably today, if Pauline Murray were alive, might want to be referred to with the pronoun they. But Pauline Murray was, as you say, the architect, the prime mover in some ways of huge chunks of what are now just simply understood aspects of both race and gender doctrine. Pauline Murray writes a law school paper at Howard University Law School, which almost doesn't admit Pauline Murray because they're not into admitting women. And the paper, without Pauline Murray's consent, nobody asked, becomes the spine of the pleadings in Brown v. Board that are used to desegregate schools.
Speaking of Thurgood Marshall, right?
Speaking of Thurgood Marshall, Pauline Murray's name is not on the brief. Pauline Murray finds out years later, oh, by the way, we used your law school paper. Pauline Murray writes the same kind of analysis about gender discrimination and the 14th Amendment that becomes the beating heart of the project that Ruth Bader Ginsburg engages in when she is at the Women's Rights Project at the ACLU. At least RBG credited Pauline Murray on the briefs, even though Pauline Murray did not participate in the briefs. But Pauline Murray was both everywhere and nowhere. Pauline Murray was desegregating lunch counters before anyone else was. Pauline Murray refused to move to the back of a bus in Virginia and got arrested long before anyone else did. And history has just almost completely erased Pauline Murray from the ledger.
Well, thank you for bringing her back to us. It's a great resurrection.
And there's a film that folks should see. Betsy West and Julie Cohen did an amazing film called My Name is Pauline Murray that I commend to anybody watching and listening, because it really opened my eyes. But maybe I'll just say this thing. To me, in a book where the thesis is, there are a lot of invisible people doing essential, I would say existential democracy work who don't get credit. Pauline Murray becomes, for me, the avatar of all of it, because Pauline Murray should have every single law school named after Pauline Murray. Pauline Murray should be in every case book. And the fact that we pick and choose who gets famous, who gets credit. And again, I think it's doubly complicated for women because nobody was going to give Pauli Murray credit.
Right.
Pauli Murray, one last story, writes to Richard Nixon and says, I hear you're casting around for the first woman justice. You know who it should be? Me. I love it. I mean, I just love that this person was so certain that they were going to do the work of carving, equality out of the 14th Amendment and did it. And we've all forgotten. It's an amazing, and in some sense, a kind of tragically American story about who gets credit.
Becca Heller. Love this chapter of the book. So this is the story of the Muslim ban, travel ban, and how it was that lawyers were recruited to go to the airport to represent detainees, and citizens, people, progressives, protesters showed up at the airport to protest. Becca Heller was with an organization that was at the center of this. I love it in the book. You call it a big unscripted constitutional flash mob. And then you called it the airport revolution. Talk a little about that, because that is really an amazing, if there are a lot of dramatic moments in the story, in the book. And you, as I said, you tell the stories in a very novelistic, illuminating way, exciting way. But this chapter in particular, I think, was very, very descriptive and evocative, because we all lived through it. But I don't think we fully appreciate it as much. I would say this, and we're going to talk about next Charlottesville. I feel like the press didn't explain the airport revolution as well as you do in Lady Justice. And the press did not in any way, in my mind, capture Charlottesville, because Charlottesville scared the crap out of me in reading your book. And it didn't. I happen to have been in Israel while it happened, but still, it didn't click in the way that it did in reading your book. So start with the airport revolution.
Well, one of the things I will just say, kind of as a precatory thought on this, is that I was hoping for your reaction, which is people saying, I vaguely remember Sally Yates. I kind of remember the Muslim ban. Like I sort of remember when they weren't letting teenage girls at the border get abortions. So it's not your memory loss. And I'm not even sure it's a failing of the press. I think it goes to how much stuff happened in such a compressed amount of time.
Yeah, but it was great stuff though, right?
It was great stuff.
It's great stuff. You'd think if you were a reporter, you're all over this. Is great stuff.
I mean, in a sense, it also, I think, is emblematic of how the news was a blender and there was just so much to cover. And I was lucky because these were all cases I covered. But I guess I will say this, and it goes to your earlier point about the work of democracy, that it doesn't fall on lawyers and lawsuits, right? And for me, Becca Heller is an amazing character because she's very young. While she's at Yale Law School, she realizes that, she's not really super sure why she's there. She's the opposite of Sally Yates in some sense.
Right.
She's not an institutionalist. She doesn't have these stirring speeches about the power and dignity of the law. And when she was in law school, she essentially co-created a tiny little organization that has grown to become IRAP, that essentially says if you are a refugee, your chance of being granted refugee status goes up exponentially if you have an attorney.
Right. And
she simply did the work of matching young law students to big firms and matching those little dyads to refugees around the world.
And without necessary immigration law experience.
With none.
It didn't even matter.
No, this was entirely the proposition, and this was what came to fruition, I think, at the airport revolution, was that you could have people who did trusts and estates, people who did divorce law. It didn't matter. If you had a lawyer with a yellow pad willing to sign a pleading, you would prevail. And so she started this group and she scaled it up. And then, as you said, when it became manifest that there were going to be many, many people who left Iraq, who left Afghanistan, who got onto planes, who sold all their worldly goods with the promise that the United States was granting them status here, and the travel ban gets signed while they're in the air. And so they land and they no longer have status, and they're being held, as you said, some of them are being held in back rooms at airports, denied entry. They're getting told, we're going to ship you back to where you came from. And where they came from is a place where they have a credible fear for their lives. The people who showed up, who surge into the void, are, as you said, the hundreds and hundreds of people who show up in airport parking lots with signs, and they're just yelling, "Let the lawyers in," which is my favorite part of that story. And then the attorneys, these volunteer attorneys who just say, "I guess I'm going to JFK right now. I guess I'm going to LAX." And they sat at baggage claim, and they pulled out their yellow pads, and they filed habeas corpus petitions. And it's an amazing story, separate and apart from the travel ban litigation that went back and forth to the Supreme Court. This is an amazing story of participatory democracy, of rule of law, of habeas corpus. It is such a love letter to these principles, these basic principles of what rule of law means. And I love the story, I think, for the same reason you do, Thane, which is it's so organic. This isn't scripted. This happens over a couple of days on Facebook and WhatsApp. And it happens because people, I think, really fundamentally said, what is happening at that airport is lawless, and I'm going to go make sure it doesn't happen. And I love that. I wish there'd been many more years of that, but to me, it's really emblematic. I think of what de Tocqueville would have said about that. He would have lost his damn mind because it's so beautiful.
Robbie Kaplan, who, by the way, has been a former guest of FOLCS before, brings a lawsuit against various neo-Nazi alt-right groups that participated in the summer of, what was it, 2018?
2017,
right, 2017, the Unite the Right rally. And I got to tell you, Dahlia, I'm sorry, I forgot that you lived in Charlottesville at that time. You and I were doing those events at the National Press Club, and I forgot why you used to get to Washington faster than I did.
Yeah, or get to New York City late
exactly.
on one occasion.
Yes, to get here. So you were actually there, which makes this even more dramatic. And your kids are in this book too, because your kids seem to pick up, they were more heads up than the parents about how dangerous it was. Honestly, I do not think Americans knew what it looked like on the ground. It sounds to me that Robbie Kaplan's complaint actually captures it in a way that none of the press picked up in terms of true details. And one of the things that you say in the book, and then I want you to address Robbie in this, is that don't let anyone tell you that this was about free speech or the First Amendment or about monuments. This is not the Skokie case. This is not just a bunch of guys that want to stand around handing out leaflets. This is something else. By the way, this has much more in common with that anecdote I said earlier about Clarence Thomas and Virginia versus Black, which is if a person is presenting a true threat, then they lose their First Amendment protection. And you can't sit around and say, I have a First Amendment right. Yes, but not to incite violence and come with a premeditated plan to attack Jews and Blacks, right?
Right. And this goes, I think, also, Thane, to your point about, this was a trial. This was Robbie Kaplan, who is probably most famous for representing Edie Windsor at the Supreme Court, which really not only laid down the tracks for the end of the Defense of Marriage Act, but for marriage equality, which came a few years later in Obergefell. So Robbie could have been done, right? And nevertheless, I think in 2017, within hours of realizing that President Trump had said there were, very fine people on both sides, and the Jeff Sessions Justice Department was not going to do an investigation. They were not going to do a civil rights investigation or bring any charges. Robbie looked around and called Karen Dunn, who is an attorney at Paul Weiss. By the way, I wanted a chapter about two fancy white shoe appellate lawyers, because I think it's goes to this, you don't all have to do, you don't have to work at the ACLU. These were both folks who took on this case, and they essentially, within a matter of weeks, filed a complaint using, ironically, the KKK Act, which they dusted off, which really said you cannot, you can bring a civil action against somebody who is trying to commit racial violence against minorities. And people laughed for exactly the reason that you're saying. First of all, it was this old statute. It had been deployed a little bit in the 60s, but not to much effect. And there were real First Amendment speech implications. A lot of First Amendment purists opposed this litigation. And the end of the story is that it took 4 years to go to trial. This thing only just went to trial in November last year, 1 year ago. So it was a 4-year slog, partly because the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists kept dropping their phones in the toilets. They refused to show up They refused to comply with discovery. I mean, they were a nightmare. Some of them acted pro se, defending themselves, and they were miserable. And by the way, they leveled like unbelievable threats against counsel in this case. But it finally goes to trial, and it's a monster win, right? It's a $26 million judgment against them. And almost nobody noticed. Almost nobody paid attention to what I think was like the Scopes monkey trial of, this era.
Yeah.
And so I think your press critique in that sense is right on point, because how is it that the single most important, I think, legal vehicle to bring people to justice for, what ended up not just being like horrible maimings, violence, racial abuse, the death of Heather Heyer, the young woman who was hit by the car
killed,
and how that kind of doesn't even surface in the national press is an amazing story about
Shocking.
What we don't pay attention to. And maybe the only other thing I will say about Charlottesville is that the very same litigation strategy that Robbie and Karen brought to bear in Charlottesville is now being used against January 6th defendants. It's being used against some of these oath keepers who are going on trial this week. And so the idea that there is a clear, bright line between protest, between checking out the gift shop at the Capitol, and between coming armed in order to create violence, or in the case of January 6th, stop an electoral process from happening. There are laws that can be used and deployed to great effect. And it's one of the reasons that the book really, I think, is about law.
But you actually say in the book that you think that Charlottesville was a preview of January 6th.
Oh,
that if you were living in Charlottesville, and as you and your husband, I think at one point, literally in the book, you lament that you're afraid to go outside and join the protesters, that you're actually afraid, that your husband is afraid. Your youngest son runs home from a park because there's just neo-Nazis everywhere. Your older son has a great line, one of the great lines in the book, where he says, "Bring a knife."
I mean, I think that it says something about the fact that for 3-4 days, the mainstream media covered the tiki torches, and they covered the chants, and they covered, the sort of systemic failure of the police to manage.
But not the menace.
And not the fact that, anybody, I think, who lived through Charlottesville 2017 would tell you what I say in the book, which is that January 6th was wholly unsurprising.
Right.
And the fact that there were credible warnings well in advance, the cops kind of knew this was going to be out of control. You could get on any number of websites and see they were organizing with guns, organizing for violence. It felt like Groundhog Day. And in some sense, I think the refusal to reckon with the menace as opposed to the spectacle is your press critique right now.
Yeah, that is exactly right. Bridget Armiri, what I love about this is a very complicated chapter for me, because you mentioned this before. This was about the undocumented teenager who's pregnant in Texas, and she wants to have an abortion. And so she's represented by Bridget Armiri in a state that would not permit, for any number of reasons, a teenager to have an abortion. But what I thought was fascinating about it is that here you say that this case is ultimately a preview of Dobbs. It's not only a preview of Dobbs, it's an audition for Brett Kavanaugh. So can you briefly explain that? Because that was really fascinating, that in this case, that eventually the girl does get her abortion, but the case no longer has any precedential value. But Kavanaugh signs a blistering, angry dissent, which you say looks to you like he was auditioning to the right wing, that I'm your guy, that if you're going to pick an anti-abortion justice, I'm the one for you.
This was a case that was really very shocking. And we've talked about, the travel ban, we've talked about Nazi marches. And even in that realm, this was a shocking case because, as you said, we had a migrant teenager in the state of Texas being held at a government sponsored shelter. And the state of Texas actually said, which it does very rarely, we're going to give you a waiver and let you terminate the pregnancy. So Texas was not the problem. The problem was the federal government.
Right.
And the federal government decided suddenly and spontaneously that they had a policy that they would not open the doors to a migrant shelter to let a teenager terminate a pregnancy, even
Essentially
though
to get out,
yeah,
to go to a doctor.
and she had, at this point, by the time it went to Brett Kavanaugh on the DC circuit, not only did she have a Texas judge, but she had a federal judge in DC signing an order saying, you have to give her this procedure immediately. And still, the shelter wouldn't allow her out. And at that point, it was appealed up to the DC circuit, where Judge Kavanaugh was seated. And as you say, Bridget Amiri had to scramble to argue this in front of the DC circuit. And Judge Kavanaugh had been left off of the short list. Donald Trump, unprecedented, had issued a short list of, these are going to be my anti-Roe picks for the Supreme Court.
Because he promised his core base that he would pick justices that would overturn Roe v. Wade. And
Right.
that list, you're telling us now, that list did not have his second pick.
It did not have Brett Kavanaugh on it.
Right.
And Brett Kavanaugh wrote, initially, when it was just the 3-judge panel, he was sort of trying to run out the clock. And he wrote an opinion saying, we just need to give her more time. And if she just has, a longer process, she was coming right up against the edge of when Texas would not have allowed her to terminate. But then when he lost on banc, when the whole DC circuit reversed him, he wrote, as you said, this blistering opinion that used all this language like abortion on demand, and, used language that was movement language, not legal language. And it really did feel to a lot of us watching as though he was saying, hey, look over me. Here I am.
He was dog whistling.
And maybe the only other thing that's relevant here is that for me, it was a canary in the coal mine case, not only insofar as we had the administration without any legal basis saying we're just simply not going to allow these teenagers to have procedures. And later on, it became clear that the officer of refugee resettlement who was in charge of this was tracking the periods, the menstrual cycles of all the young women that were in shelters. Like, it was creepy and Handmaid's Tale and all that. But I think it's also, in some sense, prescient, because post-Dobbs, we really see that the people who are going to be harmed most materially and in the most egregious ways are going to be the vulnerable. It's going to be young people, people of color, prisoners. It's going to be the poor. And so, in a sense, this felt like a dry run for the principle that we can go after these people because no one's going to stand up for them.
I'll tell you, one of the things I loved about that chapter, Dahlia, in the Amiri chapter, it's rare that a nonfiction book about a person who's an activist lawyer invokes both Margaret Atwood and John Irving. Both two novelists show up in this book in that chapter. I said, she knows the prayer for Owen Meany? Wow, that's awesome.
She does.
That's awesome.
She referenced
and then in an earlier chapter, you invoke Portia from the Merchant of Venice. The book is very literate. Vanita Gupta, a former Civil Rights Division head of the Justice Department, ends up during the Trump administration watching the Justice Department and the Civil Rights Division blow it, just basically ignore all the work that the Justice Department Civil Rights Division was known for doing. So here she is watching the undoing of her own work during the Obama administration and others in her position in prior administrations. What's interesting about this is that she becomes skeptical, even though she's a first-tier lawyer from a government in the Justice Department, runs the Civil Rights Division. She becomes skeptical that litigation could actually succeed. So she starts believing in the concept of mobilizing and strategizing and mass protest. And I thought that is an interesting thing. The turn in the book itself, Lady Justice, turns exactly in that way, where the one lawyer who's, I think she was, I forgot what other things, she's clearly a gung-ho lawyer and at the highest level of the echelon, decide, you know what, there's another thing that will work better.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the point you made before, that if you confine yourself to like the law and order, then you're going to miss everything, because you can win trials and win trials and win trials and lose democracy, right? And I think the other thing that she stands for, like, you're such an astute reader of it, but like, she is exactly the pivot point of the book.
Right.
I mean, I wanted the book to turn on her, and maybe we're saying that Vanita won this signature trial in Tulia, Texas, that was a horrific police misconduct case. And she won it, and nationwide ripple effects. And if anyone had cause to say winning trials, that's the trick. And yet she's the one who comes away again on that theme of, I've been using the law as a mechanism for freedom and for dignity and for equality. And now I'm watching it being weaponized against vulnerable people. And I think she is at the center of the book, because that's the thing she struggles with. And you're quite right. Then she becomes head of
pro-democracy.
Head of the leadership conference. And the work that she does is all this organizing, coalition building. I should note that she's now number 3 in the Justice Department. So she's back inside the system. But I think exactly aware of the thing you're describing, Thane, which is, this is not just legal work. This is massive structural democracy reform.
But yes, but Dahlia, this is where I want to go back to women make it better. I know you don't want to do that thing. You'll let Thane do that. But I think that there's something here about the pivoting and the agility that someone who's a bump trained law and order specialist actually can pivot and has the agility to end up being also a really good movement organizer, right?
Yeah.
And that's not what we think of with prosecutors, right? We don't think of them that way, that she ended up being just as good. And guess what? She turned around and went back to being a prosecutor. And I think it would have been a tougher sell, a tougher job for a man. I have a great anecdote for you. I want to tell it briefly. It was when Justice Breyer was on FOLCS. And he told this anecdote, and it freaked everyone out. And it just fits here nicely. We were doing the film. We had the series Conversations on Essential Cinema, and we were watching with the justice. We saw the John Ford film, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. And you remember, you have John Wayne, who's the guy with the gun. You have Jimmy Stewart, who's the lawyer, who goes out to the West, the far reaches of the West, and he goes, I'm a lawyer. And they just basically kick him on the floor, and they kick his books. Like, these books don't mean anything here. And Breyer says in this discussion at point, he says, sometimes, he says, a person just talks too much. Sometimes you need to bring a gun. Okay. And the room went, whoa.
Yeah.
A progressive, a liberal, the leader of the liberal wing of the Supreme Court, right? And he was raising a point that sometimes the democracy hinges on something else. And sometimes you need a John Wayne, and Jimmy Stewart is not the right guy. And I think that chapter, the Gupta chapter, to me, is a little like that anecdote about, and what his point was to say, remember, Brown versus Board of Education, in the end, you needed the National Guard. Yeah. That's what he said. In the end, you needed to bring John Wayne in to enforce the law. It wouldn't work with just a guy with some books. And that's, it, to me, what I think is really great about this book is it shows a certain agility that these particular women have. The next woman is Dahlia Lithwick. There's a chapter sort of about you. It's about the Me Too movement, and about an incident that happened to you when you were a law clerk in the Ninth Circuit, with what at the time, he wasn't your judge, Judge Kaczynski, who made inappropriate comments to you, and you buried it for 20 years. And then somewhere in the Me Too movement, when we saw Harvey Weinstein, Les Moonves, it was hitting different industries. And all of a sudden, the casting couch was no longer an excuse in Hollywood. And now it seemed like whatever the casting couch was for federal judges was no longer available. And so can you talk a little about this? Because there were a number of women who came forward anonymously. A number of women came forward vocally, openly. And then you wrote what was then became a landmark column, your column on this story, in which you came out yourself saying, hey, this happened to me too.
I think I would say two things. One is that I couldn't possibly have written a book that included Me Too and included Anita Hill and included Me Too in the judiciary and not included myself. And so That was difficult and yet I think necessary. And then I think the other thing that I wanted to write about when I wrote that column, which was 4 years ago, was that I was really interested in writing a meditation about complicity. I had no reason to believe, I mean, what Judge Kaczynski said to me was utterly trivial compared to, many, many women who have.
But can I just say something? You call it something much worse. I think you use the word moral cowardice.
Oh, I was very angry
and
I
thought you were very hard on yourself in the book.
Well, I think, a couple of things. One is, and this is the point, this was another one of those open secrets. This was not a handful of us that knew. Everybody knew. And the moral cowardice was that everybody knew. And because of the tragedy of groups, everybody thought somebody else needed to come forward. And the reason I'm hard on myself is two of the women who came forward before I did both experienced and in one case, like really awful, like he showed her porn and diminished her and belittled her for a year while she clerked for him.
Because you didn't work for him.
I did not work for him.
He just singled you out.
He said something dumb. He said a lot of dumb things, but
he was on the phone with you.
Yeah.
I mean, he said a lot of inappropriate things.
He said inappropriate things, but there were women who subsequently came forward who he had touched and who were much, much more quote unquote victims. But the point for me wasn't
can I just tell the audience it's something I've neglected to say? This was a rock star judge.
Yes.
Right, a feeder to the Supreme Court, right? This is not just a federal judge, right?
This was, and I think, one of the most beloved across the ideological spectrum as a brilliant writer, a brilliant thinker, just a really important jurist, but somebody who just acted out terribly and everybody knew it and no one did anything. And I think one of the things that made me feel very culpable was not only did I keep this secret, but I told everyone who asked me over decades, like, don't clerk for him. It's not worth it. So everybody knew this. And my point partly was that these two women who suffered in a much more tangible way than I did wouldn't have suffered if I had stepped forward earlier. And that was, you say I'm hard on myself. I think I'm complicit. But for me, the piece was really trying to think through how you can get in a situation where every law school knows, every law student knows, almost every appeals court judge knows, everybody knows, and everybody just says, someone else is responsible. That was, for me, the thing that was morally reprehensible.
Well, can I ask just one other question about that? Because people always say that if I was in Nazi Germany and I wasn't Jewish, I would be hiding and rescuing Jews. And the first answer is, really? You're so sure? You're really so sure you were ready to stand up to the Nazis? You feel so strongly, and you know that you have this experience. But in the book, you talk about how people feared for years not to come forward because they believed it would ruin their legal careers. And you're talking about people who went to the top law schools, who made law review, who got positions on the Ninth Circuit, right? Do you think that we can understand the complicity? We feel it all the time, right? People are constantly not speaking up, right? I mean, the bystander is always the majority. The perpetrators are always the minority. That's the crazy thing, right? More people are just standing around and watching. But is it also true that, in fact, people might have ruined their legal careers?
I mean, I think, first of all, you said the magic word, which is he was a feeder judge.
Yeah.
So there are a handful of federal appeals court judges. And if you clerk for them, you will get a job at the Supreme Court. And by the way, Brett Kavanaugh clerked for him. And by the way, Brett Kavanaugh was one of the people that worked with Judge Kaczynski to pick clerks for Justice Kennedy. So this is a
In fact, I think in the book you point out that Kaczynski's son clerked for Kavanaugh.
Yeah, I mean, this is not a super good system, federal judicial clerkships.
That's a great sentence.
Maybe we'll just leave that.
Yeah, leave it at that.
But so there are material harms to turning away that clerkship. But I think, and this is important, almost every one of the women who came forward, went on the record, all of them asked, including me, for the same thing, which was an investigation. Nobody wanted him to step down. We just wanted an investigation, which didn't happen. Well,
yeah. Can I just step in and finish that up? Because I want to talk about something directly about that.
Well,
you seem to lament that there was no reckoning. You point out that there were some of the women feel this way and you feel this way, right? I mean, that you lament that there's, he retired with his lifetime pension and that's it.
Yeah. And that's my lament about Brett Kavanaugh, that there was purportedly an FBI investigation that it turns out was a tip line that went directly to the White House, and all of those went directly to the dumpster. There was no investigation. And my view across all these cases, and it's been my view, I've written this piece 10 times, is that Me Too, in the absence of an investigation and fact-finding, is not a legal process. It's many things, but it is not a legal process. And maybe just that the judiciary cannot police itself. The entity tasked with investigating findings of facts, legal conclusions, cannot seem to do that for their own judges is shocking.
There is a quick consolation that I don't know it'll be enough for you. But Terence Dupre wrote a book called The Survivor. And he was talking about Holocaust survivors from concentration camps and Hiroshima survivors. And he said that for many people, the purpose of survival is to bear witness. That bearing witness is its own remedy, right? That one should think about it as its own remedy. I am embarrassed to say this. I have to go. My computer is losing battery. Give me 30 seconds this has never happened. I'll be right back.
Here's the portion of the show where I shall sing and dance. Maybe I'll say just because somebody put a question in the Q&A, and I will say this. It was a very good question about how do you account for the Eileen Cannons and the Sidney Powells and the women who have been, really the cornerstones of eroding the rule of law. And how can you make claims about women if there are so many women who were involved in trying to set aside the 2020 election in the courts? And I want to answer it because I think it's not just a good question. I think it's the good question. And I think the answer to that question is, again, I never wanted to make claims that every single woman in the world had a special relationship with the law. And the book doesn't make that claim. But I also think that, one of the things that I lament about the pouring of dark money into the process of finding judges is that it becomes really, really easy. If you give Leonard Leo $1.6 billion in dark money, he will find the women who will look as though they are representative of all women's views. And I think it's just profoundly distorting. So I want to be very, very clear to the questioner. I am not saying that every single woman is a progressive or every single woman in the book is an avatar for all women. But I am saying I think that the effect of dark money on seating judges has very, very much corrupted the kinds of people who are sitting on the bench and whether they are in fact emblematic of the views of all women.
Remember what I said about the agility of women? You just proved that, right?
By answering the question?
No, you just said you found something for you to do that was worthy and part of the night, while I embarrassingly ran off to get a charger for the computer. So I apologize for that. But again, there was no silence. We didn't miss a moment. Dahlia went right to the question. Before we take another question from the audience, I want to talk a little about Stacey Abrams. Because this is the chapter that really deals with voter suppression. And the Supreme Court just this week heard a case in Alabama dealing with the Voting Rights Act and a claim of voter suppression. And Stacey Abrams, your entire chapter is devoted to what her experience was in running for governor in Georgia and her post experience in continuing to galvanize and register votes of Black and brown people. And what's interesting about it on many levels is that fight is being played out yet again in states all across the country. And Stacey Abrams, in many ways, the book is so interesting in the fact that it identifies previews, sneak peeks at something even worse, right? We didn't, you talk about Judge Kavanaugh when he was just Judge Kavanaugh, and he gave you a preview of something. The Charlottesville chapter is a preview of January 6th. The Stacey Abrams chapter is a preview of what happened after the 2020 election and what states attempted to do in passing new laws to suppress the votes of minorities. So maybe we can talk a little about Stacey Abrams. We'll take one last question. We'll say goodnight.
One thing I want to say about Stacey Abrams is that she's I had mentioned that she's an amazing bookend for Sally Yates, both women in Georgia. She's also an amazing bookend for Pauli Murray, who we talked about, the great forgotten Pauli Murray, because in addition to being all the things that Pauli Murray was also a gorgeous poet. And Pauli Murray ended up leaving the law to go to divinity school. And the last few years of Pauli Murray's life was as an ordained priest. And I say all this to say that I love the symmetry of ending on Stacey Abrams, who is an avowed fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, who writes romance novels.
Yeah.
I just think there is a story here that is complicated and very powerful and beautiful. So that's the first thing. And then I think that, I've said this a couple of times, but I'll say it again, the last 3 chapters of the book are not about winning lawsuits. They are about systematic efforts to undermine democracy, and whether that is the stuff that Stacey Abrams has named and fought long before we knew about what it was to have, purges of the voter rolls, where you throw people off the voter rolls before an election, or closing minority precincts, or doing away with Sunday voting,
or the trivial, the exact matching of.
Yeah, the exact signature match. So all of that stuff. And then the following chapter is Nina Perales, who's doing gerrymandering, which is quite literally efforts to subvert, that basic ideas of one person, one vote, and majority rule. And the book had to end there for exactly the reason you're saying, because these problems are not solved. And I wanted to say every one of the people that I profile in the book has won, and won huge. Yeah. And so that signals to me we can win again. But you're exactly right that in some sense, these are early iterations of fights that we are still having. And maybe the most telling moment in the Merrill case this week, the first Monday of October, court term begins. And as Thane just mentioned, there's the last gasp of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is on the block. And it's so powerful that the person, I think, in oral argument, and folks should listen, who says the notion that the Constitution is race blind, that we cannot use the 14th Amendment or the Civil Rights Act to remediate racial harms, is completely ahistoric, and more importantly, atextual. Mm-hmm. And she goes back and she just reads from the reports. Ketanji Brown Jackson, on her second day on the bench, this is obviously not race blind. It was trying to remediate racial harms. And there's something so extraordinary about having this project of using text in history, right? This is the original meaning. This is what the 14th and 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment were drafted to do, read by the descendant of slaves on both sides and a woman, as a marker of, yes, it's true. She's going to be in dissent for a long time. She is, by every metric, losing. But it's exactly what you said. She's creating a record. She's making an accounting and doing it in this just, I think, powerful, powerful voice that every single person who heard it knew exactly what she was saying. Right.
It's the point that I was making before I had to run off to get my charger. Terence Dupre said, the will to bear witness it's a remedy on its own. Yeah. That even if you lose, creating the record, making the point, and I love the way you told the audience that she used the word atextual and ahistorical, because the audience may not realize that the Supreme Court in the last few terms has been obsessed with the idea of history and text. So she's saying, as a progressive, she's going, wait a minute, I thought you guys talked about history a lot. Well, what you're just saying now is ahistorical, and it's not textual either. Dahlia, we're going to say goodnight to you in a second. So tonight, unfortunately, this night has come to an end. Let's just say, I think we have last few announcements. Madeline, take us through, and then we'll say goodnight to Dahlia. What do we have? I think we have an event coming up next week. Yes, right. Oh yeah, our partners at the 92nd Street Y. So this is both a live event at the 92nd Street Y and it's an online event. Andrew Yang, who's a former candidate for president and mayoral candidate here in New York City, who's trying to start a third party, giving us a third choice. And we'll be in conversation with him next week. We have a bunch of things that we're not ready to announce yet, but they're really, really great. And the only way you'll know about them is if you make sure that you're on folks.org, you get the email address, and then we'll give you advance notice, even if you're a YouTube channel participant. Let us know where you are so we can make sure that you know our audience has been growing for 15 years and it's huge, and we're very grateful to you all. Speaking of grateful, yes, we are a nonprofit and we haven't been charging all throughout the pandemic in order to make this kind of charming, entertaining, lively, and super smart program that Dahlia Lithwick entertained us with, and we were so glad to have her as our hosted her tonight. And we make that possible. So if you can, as the year comes to an end, if we can be in your thoughts, we'd appreciate it. Dahlia, I adore you. You truly are a national treasure. And I don't think I'm exaggerating. I think that the people who follow you, the people who read you, they depend on you. They depend on your wit, your knowledge, your mind, your agility, and your friendship. I certainly do. Love you, Dahlia. This was really awesome. The book is sold out, but they're printing more copies. Lady Justice, Women, the Law, and the Battle to Save America. If you're going to read one book before the end of the year, this is the one. You saw Dahlia in action. I read you some of the book. There's nothing more interesting, nothing more entertaining, more enlightening, and it'll teach you something. You'll be more interesting by reading this book. Dahlia, good night. I'm Thane Rosenbaum for FOLCS.
Thank you.